Right.
So, start with your name and where you were born, please.
Okay, so I'm Kate Goodall. I was actually born Bridget Landon, but I depolled my first name. I was born in London many years ago.
Okay, tell us a bit about yourself, please.
So I grew up in a really nice, comfortable family home. Failed my 11 plus really badly, so I ended up going to a Catholic convent school, which will feature later in sort of the evolution of what I did and what motivated me. My mum was an artist, my father was a professor of medicine, and I ended up going to medical school when I was a teenager. So that's my background really, and then medicine all the way through my 20s, working in various hospitals up and down the country, the Isle of Man, happened to be half Manx, and met my husband working down in Sussex, doing casualty, married, have a daughter, and then ended up in Blakenhall as a result of a choice made by my husband, who was quite ill with secondary cancer of the lungs. And sadly, he passed 10 years ago, but I've made my community now Blakenhall in the West Midlands, and very happy here.
Okay. So, what got you into the arts?
I think as a small girl, it was watching my mum, who had 3 kids, a very busy life, try and be an artist in the kitchen. She'd have an easel, she'd have her set of oil paint, she'd go to art classes once a week. And I was fascinated by the figure. She did a lot of figure work. She loved ballet, she loved the Degas pictures of the ballerinas. And I would, in my spare time, get her to show me how to draw legs or arms. Never wanted anything for Christmas or birthday but a drawing pad and pencils. So right from the beginning, I had a fascination for art. And when I was 17, 18, having done English A-levels, I wanted to go and work at Madame Tussauds as an artist and do the figure work, but wrote them a letter, got no reply, ended up getting a sensible job, as my dad said. So went to med school through a conversion study course. And there, of course, I fell into a wonderful opportunity to study the human body, because the original great artists like Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo had access to cadavers. So as a medical student, I learned all about human anatomy. Later decided that much as I loved the clinical scene, I wasn't really geared to it. I was quite a quiet person. I didn't like the high demand of being on the end of the bleep all the time, getting 3 hours sleep over a weekend or whatever. So I went into medical illustration. And at that point, in my 30s, decided that I'd illustrated a book, and on the way up to get this book published, which was an illustrated atlas of trauma management, because a lot of people were dying within the first hour of major trauma, say car accidents, whatever. And they realised there was this golden hour, that if you could get to those patients and treat them in that first hour, they were more likely to survive. So my late husband and I, with a guy at Hope Hospital in Salford, did a book, the Advanced Trauma Life Support System, and I illustrated it, about 600 illustrations. And on the way up, talk about coincidence, I met a girl from the Slade School of Fine Art and said, look, you know, I'm an anatomist, we're on the way to get the book published. She said, have you ever thought of coming to a life drawing studio? And I said, well, I'm 32 now. I said, I haven't really got a body of artwork, but I'd be fascinated to learn anatomy from living models. So she said, I'll tell you what. She wrote some names down on the back of my checkbook. Back then we had checkbooks. And I ended up just writing a letter to the Slade School of Fine Art and got a phone call to say, look, we've got 400 candidates for 12 or so places in the life room. You're going to have to apply through the regular channels, bring your portfolio, queue up with 400 candidates. We'll have a look at your work, but it doesn't sound like you're a strong candidate. So within 3 days, I then got a call from a lady called Jo Volley, and I was invited for an interview with a very well-known artist called Ewan Uglow. He was a figure artist, and Jo. And I took the one oil painting I'd got, and I borrowed my husband's oil paints, and I bought a canvas, and I put an easel up in my lounge, and I'd done an oil painting of Jesus and his mother, not religious figures, just a man and a woman, and he had to go to the cross, and she knew something dramatic and awful was about to happen, and you've got her hand on his chest and his hand on her shoulder, and his gaze is the mid-distance, and she's looking really sad. And I'd just done that oil painting in a kind of a chiaroscuro, which is a light-dark method of oil painting where the light's very unnatural light. It's more like an oil light effect. And I took that to my interview along with the book illustrations I got. And when Ewan Hugo saw it, he started to cry. And I knew that it was oil paintings was something I'd never worked in before, but I almost kind of had an understanding of how to use them, and it was just a gift I'd been given, I'd say. So as a result of that, he said, look, I'm going to take you up to the Life Room because this is where you'll be working from the autumn. So I got a place, and I was there 2 years, studying under Ewan Hugo and other artists in the Life Room, while teaching anatomy at Barts in the Royal London. It was then at Mile End, so I used to work, go to the studio, and I did that for 2 years. And as a result of it, my entire canvas size changed, my ability to understand applied human anatomy, and they did a wonderful course at the University College London. It was called the Peggington course, and it was basically to teach artists anatomy. And they asked me if I'd carry on because the late Prof Peggington, he'd passed, and he had a huge slide collection. And I said, well, can I use Professor Peggington's anatomical and fine art slide collection? And they said, well, his niece has got the whole collection, but we'll copy it for you. So I got all these 300 slides made up, and I ran a course for the first time since 1308 for artists and doctors, because if you don't know it, artists and doctors used to be part of the same guild, because the artists and doctors would buy pigments and various things from the apothecaries guild. So artists had access to cadavers through physicians, and therefore I said to the University College Anatomy Department, why don't we once more re-establish cadaver study for artists, because every artist, as Leonardo and Michelangelo would say, needs access to three-dimensional human anatomy. So we taught that for about 3 years, and then sadly the course stopped, but I carried on teaching that at the Heatherley School of Fine Art. And then I was invited by the Slade to do a summer school lecture, and I thought, what of all the topics I've covered would be a medical artist aspect to something that the fine art world was familiar with. And I thought, I know, I could choose the crucifixion, because as a medic and a medical illustrator, I could take the anatomy and the physiology and the whole scenario of what had happened to Jesus during those last 24 hours of his life, and then compare it with the fine art treatment of crucifixion, understanding that anything you see in the fine art world was not reflective of what really happened in a Roman scourging and crucifixion. Most of us have seen the Mel Gibson film, but this was like 14 years before the Mel Gibson film came out. Yes, it was 1992, 93 I was doing this. So I literally took my knowledge and did a lot of research and a lot of experiments, and I presented a visual, two-dimensional art demonstration of what Jesus went through, the reality of his human death and suffering. And then I said, this is well, fine art depicts it. And from the 6th century onwards, crucifixion was so taboo, it was you couldn't depict it. It was such a taboo to talk about, even in biblical times, because it was a death reserved for criminals and slaves. And for Jesus to have died this way was such a stigma, which is why a lot of people couldn't accept that a saviour or Messiah could have died in that way. So nobody had actually recorded visually what a Roman scourging and crucifixion looked like. And it took, well, I did a lot of research, but then when Mel Gibson did his film, it's so accurate. It's just, it brought to the screen and three-dimensional views what I had tried to depict two-dimensionally. So as a result of that, I began a 25-year study on the medical aspects of the crucifixion, did so much research, and I took it to prisons, universities, medical schools and churches. And I think what I had become a Christian in this time, and by that I mean I was raised not to be a Christian, baptized, whatever, but I'd had an incredible supernatural experience, and my faith had come alive. People have different terms for that, but for me the presence of God was in the room. There was a light, a heaviness of presence, and there was a weight to that presence, and I'd call it almost like a glory cloud, for want of better words. And I just feel that there was a door that opened in my life of a sense of purpose about bringing through art the fact that I feel that we are a three-dimensional world incubated in a fourth dimension, that's the real spirit realm. And I wanted to kind of understand that for myself. And I think when I went into prisons, I was given an opportunity to go into the life wing at Strangeways, a young woman in my 30s. I took my slides in and I got to talk to the lifers in their chapel hour. And it was their response that made me realise, actually, Jesus had come, Jesus' greatest impact and what he'd done and who he was as a person and what he suffered really impacted these guys, because their response was so real, so authentic, so genuine. It wasn't at an intellectual level, it was at a heart level. And that kind of made me think about the importance of and the value of every single human being, whatever their life journey, wherever they find themselves, prison cell, life wing, they're all special and they're all loved. And I wanted to bring the value that God gives to human life and the value that caused him to sacrifice his son for every human life, to bring these lost kids back into his family. And I thought, yes, I just want to show you how you're loved. And it was kind of, my art became the language of expression. I could get away from the intellectualism and the academic language. There was a surgeon called Barbe, whose book I read, called A Doctor at Calvary, and he said, doctors and surgeons have a language for the sufferings and death of Jesus that the person who's not had a medical training does not have. And we need to express that in terms that people understand, so they can understand the impact and what that meant for Jesus and the value God accords to our lives. And so I thought, well, I can take that one further. I can put scientific language into layman's terms, or I can actually show it. And I've got the skill set to show it. So my art very much for 25 years became about the cross and the crucifixion. And as I say, I travel with that. And when John had died back in 2015, my late husband, we hit COVID some 5 years later. And I just started to think about, I watched the Chernobyl series, I had a lot of time on my hands. And I thought, you know what? Everything that the community went through in Pripyat and throughout the wider Ukraine impacted their well-being. And I saw radiation as a kind of metaphor for sin, what it does to the body, what it does to plant life, what it does to the soil, the human pride and ego that was behind the reactor blowing up, and the common honour and courage and bravery amongst everyday normal people to try and deal with the fallout. So I then developed a series around Chernobyl and Ukraine and the heroes and main players, if you want for a better word, the lives that were featured in the series, representative of a community of people who suffered the worst possible catastrophe in the natural level and how it was dealt with. So I just developed parallels then with scripture and the whole Chernobyl event, seeing radiation as a kind of a sin that contaminates everything it comes into contact with. There's no solution for it, so all the authorities could do was put a sarcophagus, which is still standing today, over it. But given that the radioactivity is going to go on for multiplied thousands and thousands of years, that sarcophagus can only cover the effect. I thought, well, in the Old Testament, you've got this entire temple sacrifice system that could only cover sin, but it was basically an essential ingredient to human experience that caused death, sickness, suffering, and the loss of everything that we had been created for. And I thought, well, what was the solution? What is the solution? And for sin and the spiritual element, it was Jesus. And I thought, if you take the firefighter, Vasily, and his wife, Lyudmila, when Vasily went in to fight the roof fire on the reactor, which turned out to be, the core of the reactor being exposed, from the series that the firefighters died horrible, agonizing deaths over the next few months. And in reality, when Lyudmila visited her husband in, I think it was Hospital 7 in Moscow, she stayed with him for the entire time on the same ward, in the same location, while he died, because she wanted to be by his side, just as Jesus' mother was by the side of the cross. The men abandoned, they went off, but the women stayed. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the people that loved Jesus for who he was. And she stayed to the very end, but she was carrying his child. She was 6 months pregnant, and that innocent child took all that radiation into its body and was born with disabilities. And I thought, in a sense, isn't that exactly what Jesus did? So from the time of him being born, he took into his body, through his suffering, everything that had gone wrong in the human condition, but became the solution so that sin wasn't covered, it was dealt with once for all. And this isn't about a preach, but my paintings can only kind of be interpreted through a lens of a spiritual narrative. And I want that to be relational, and I want that to be human, because the gospel message about God loving the world so much that he sent in the flesh his spiritual son to die as a man for the human condition, it's become so cliched, so rarefied, and presented through a lens that actually to a lot of people has become irrelevant. It doesn't reach real hearts. It doesn't change the lives of necessarily of the people that need that message the most, to know that whatever they've done, however they've messed up, there's a profound spiritual loving remedy for that condition. And so I wanted through art to explore a narrative visual journey for people. We're a visual generation, and I think it's a skill set I've been given, and it's a journey that's still evolving. And I guess during COVID, I obviously didn't know that Ukraine was going to be invaded, that Chernobyl would once again feature on the news while Russian missiles were falling and various army units were fighting over it with this sarcophagus there containing the radiation. But I see now another narrative, the political situation globally. And I am so aware as I deal with this art that we are a three-dimensional world incubated in a fourth-dimensional spirit realm. There are forces of light, there are forces of darkness, and whatever your understanding of that, there is a whole spiritual warfare motif that runs through the entire Bible. And in a sense, I'm looking at the story of Jesus' life, the Old Testament. I'm looking at the metaphor of Ukraine and Chernobyl. It is a warfare motif, it's a warfare narrative, and the central characters are basically in a war to overcome whatever's being thrown at them. And I just want people to realise that, religion, it's an active thing that you can get involved with. It's not passive, it's not effete, it's not feminine. We get this attitude from a lot of men in the front line of ministry that the church is irrelevant, it's become feminized, it's full. But, women are warriors too, men are warriors too, and I want people to kind of understand that whatever they've been through in life, they can be equipped to deal with it, to fight it, that they have that courage and they can find that solution to their issues. So that's kind of what's generated the art. There's a lot more I could say, but I don't want to be at risk of being boring or repetitive.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Okay, so I think I've
been out of my mouth and it's been 18 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's great.
All right.
So can you tell me more about the third and fourth dimension from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up, as I say, not being church, not having any exposure to religion, but I came to a point where I started to read some books. I wanted to find out for myself, what I sensed that there is something way beyond the human condition, that we're more than flesh and blood. I think within everybody's heart there is a sense of there being a component that doesn't die when your physical body goes. I had a sense of being something more than just my mind, will and emotions. So I explored various people who gave their understanding and their experiences, and I hit upon a book by a South Korean pastor who'd been a Buddhist, and he was dying of tuberculosis, and he had about 6 weeks to live, and he happened to be 18 years at the time, no money to pay for medicines, and this is probably back in the 1950s, and his name was Paul Yonggi Cho. And a young girl of 11, a high school student, came knocking on his door, and she wanted to share her faith with him. She had a Bible with her, and he shut the door and he said, "No, I'm not interested. I've got 6 weeks alive." He was spitting blood and whatever, and she said, "Please, this is so important to you." And she came back day after day, even though he was rude and slammed the door. And in the end, he said, "Oh, just to get her to go away once and for all," he said, "What have you got to say?" She said, "Please, sir," she said, "I'd like you to read this because," she said, "there's an answer to your situation here." And he thought, "Well, I'm very sick, I'm dying, I've got no money. The parents can't afford medicine. I don't know what's in this book." So he opened it and he started to read through Genesis. She said, "Please, sir, I don't think you've got long enough to read the Old Testament, but would you start in the New Testament?" So he said he sat down and he read about the Gospels and the life of Jesus and the kind of people that Jesus healed, the lepers, the kind of people Jesus loved. He loved on the prostitutes and the publicans and the people that the religious figures would have nothing to do with because they thought they were beneath them. And he said he suddenly realized, well, actually, Jesus healed people. So he said, "God, if there is a God, unknown God, I don't know if this is real, but if you are real, heal me." And he said within 3 days, the blood had dried up, the cough had gone, and he said he never looked back. So he then began to think about the spiritual realm that he'd encountered because the doctors had no remedy for him. And I've seen this. I've seen, medicine as a doctor where doctors have no remedy, where people die of cancer. And it began to interest me. There is a dimension beyond this. And Yonggi Cho phrased it this way. He said, we're spiritual beings and we happen to be housed in bodies and we have mind, will and emotions, which we loosely call our soul. He said, but our spirits are capable and were the part of us that was designed to relate to this bigger dimension. And he said, God is a spirit and God relates to a spirit to spirit. So he said it's very difficult for human beings to know God or have a sense of the reality of God when they're just dealing with their natural intellect, their natural emotions, etc. So he said that's why God had to send Jesus in the form of a person, because we'd basically been spiritually detached and cut off from him. It's like the original design of the human was that our spirits were created to be alive to the spirit realm. And through deliberate choices, humankind walked away from that relationship and aliveness. And if you like, that detachment, it was like the Wi-Fi being cut, basically. So we had a Wi-Fi connection to the spirit realm. Well, you can't see Wi-Fi, you can't see radio signals, you can't see TV signals, but we know they're there, they have to be, because there's a communication. Same thing happened to me spiritually. I just knew that I knew that I knew I'd had an encounter with the living God. I'd felt the presence of God. I suddenly began to, I wanted that relationship, and I said I wanted that relationship. I made it my business to read the Bible and to learn about the context of the kind of relationship God wants to have with us and how he's restored that through a relationship with Jesus and understanding that I don't have to be good enough to have a relationship with God. Jesus has been good enough. I just have to accept that I can't be good enough. There's nothing I can do to earn anything, but Jesus has made that bridge for me. Having done that, I just felt a Wi-Fi connect. There was a Wi-Fi connection, and I began to understand things about people. I began to understand things about events. And it sounds patronizing to say it's hard for people to understand, but I have begun to see the world through the motif that the Bible describes, where he says we're in a spiritual battle. There has always been an enemy of God. We give him the name Satan, which means accuser. But Jesus spoke of a real devil. Jesus encountered a real devil. Jesus said he'd come to destroy his works. And I look at it like this. The fourth dimension is a realm in which we're incubated, that we can have a spiritual internet connection with, but we've got to make sure we're connected to the right channel. And my understanding is only Christ provides a safe way. Now, people have tried all sorts of things, including me. As a young person, I dabbled in the occult. I went to a fortune teller when I was 20, a palm reader, whatever. And people with a genuine intent to fill that spiritual, to reconnect the Wi-Fi, do all sorts of things. But for me, I went down this channel, and Yonggi Cho gave me the best context for it, that we are in a matrix, which is a spiritual matrix. We're surrounded by spirit beings we can't see. They're very real. They're good, they're bad. But we have to understand that the things that happen in the world in a geopolitical sense, that we are a very small part of a much bigger dimension, and a lot of what we're going through, we can frame within this context, and there is a remedy for it, which is what a lot of people would call prayer. It's putting yourself safely in the hands of God. It's asking for God to meet need. It's relating to God as a provider, comforter, protector. That doesn't mean we're passive, but we are asked to engage with the world in whichever way. I think everybody, there's a lovely quote in Jeremiah, and it says, before you were formed in the womb, or while you were being knitted together in mother's womb, before you were ever really existed as a baby in the natural world, I knew you, and I've got a plan for your life. That's not just true of Jeremiah, that's true of every living soul on this planet. God has a plan for their lives. They are uniquely valued, uniquely designed. Male, female, black, white, yellow, purple. We are all placed here with a destiny, and it's a case of catching up to that point of revelation. And there's a picture I've done over there of Jesus as a 12-year-old boy. I don't think for a second Jesus was born knowing he was God's son, Messiah incarnate, to ultimately be crucified and redeem the world. I think it was a process of him as a little boy, with the Holy Spirit on the inside of him, reading Torah, because they only had the parts of the Old Testament in Jewish culture. And then when he was, just before he became a son of the law at 13, we read it was Passover, he's in Jerusalem, and he's woken up to the fact there's a destiny on his life, because his mum and dad have headed back to Jerusalem with the relatives and friend from Nazareth. They've left Jerusalem, headed back to Nazareth. Jesus stays in the temple, talking to learned scribes and teachers and Pharisees of the time, trying to learn more about Scripture. And it says they were amazed at his wisdom and the questions he asked. Why? Because on the cusp of turning 13 and becoming a son of the law, he'd read the Torah, and he began to understand, actually, a lot of what's written there witnesses to me. I am the son of a virgin. These shepherds, this is the circumstance of my birth. This is what my mum's told me. I know in my spirit something's stirring, and I have to be about my Father's business. And I think in every life, God is wanting us to open that window to him, connect the Wi-Fi, give him a chance to speak to us, and learn what the Father's business is in our generation, in our field, where we live, in our community. And it may be as important as, and I put this at the top of the list because I've been a mum myself, being a mum, because I'm responsible for the next generation. I am responsible for how my daughter turns out, the kind of person she is, the kind of family she will establish. That's not a sexist thing to say. I think that the greatest attack has come against women. Now, I'm quite a feminist. I push through in medicine against terrible, terrible bigotry and elitist attitudes from men, Freemasonry institutions in the hospitals barring women from doing surgery, prizes women couldn't sit for because they weren't the sons of surgeons. Stupid stuff that went on when I was young.
Even though those ladies was...
Oh yeah, I had the medal for my college, medical college, but I wasn't allowed. They wanted me to feel a second-class citizen. They wanted me to feel not to try. We were told as women when we went into the medical school, and I won't name it, that we were only there. There were more women students that year than men for the first time, because ultimately we'd all get married and go and be GPs, and it would give a chance for the proper jobs to go to the boys. We were told that.
Wow.
That was a discrimination. And I remember sitting there, and a female trainee surgeon came down, and she was in tears, and she said, I've just been to see the Prophet's surgery because I want a job. And he said, look, I'm going to be really honest, but I'll deny it if you quote me. He said, as a woman, you can never be a Freemason, therefore you can never be a surgeon at this hospital. Now, that was back then, and I'm not saying it's now, but that was the reality that we, as female medical students, grew up with back in the day. I was told, even though I had the medal in anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry, I was told by my professor of anatomy that he could never write a reference for me to be a surgeon, because surgeons had asked him not to bother to write references for women, and I was only the second demonstrator in anatomy that they ever had. And, I worked very, very hard. I had to prove myself, But what I'm trying to say is, my great aunt was one of the first female doctors to go to the Royal Free. We were kind of a pioneer women. So I'm all for women being in the workforce. This isn't a feminist thing. But nor would I ever say that the most important job I've ever done is not medicine, it's being a mum. And I think that, we have to understand that there is a call in each of our lives. And if you take the world value system, they'll say it's about power. They'll say it's about money. They'll say it's about status. I say it's having the spiritual courage and character to be like the divers that swam under the Chernobyl reactor to turn off the valves so other people could live. I think it's like the miners that went down and laid a concrete platform under the reactor, knowing that the whole 400 of them would never live beyond a few months after that because of the radiation exposure. It's the solid humanity, courage and strength of people that own that their life is not just for them, it's for the next generation, it's for the community. And if you can change the values the world have and bring in the values, we call them the kingdom of God values, but it's basically the values God has in heaven and wants to bring back to earth, because that's how he designed us, then we all of us have a responsibility, a gifting and a call on our lives for that eureka moment to say, hey, what? I'm going to try and build a different value system on this planet. I might be a small part, nobody may see me, but I know that what I am doing is going to lay down a foundation for a better world for my kids, my grandkids, whatever. And that has to have a spiritual awareness, because we have to understand that there are real forces that want to that want to change the status quo, that want to demolish values that we as a nation and we as people know are right values. And I just remember hearing recently, one of the really old school preachers I loved was a guy called Derek Prince. And I heard a comment recently by a woman who said, back in the 80s, Derek Prince had been to speak to a Christian convention somewhere. And in the taxi on the way back to the hotel, she and her husband were dropping him off. He started to bawl. He started to cry on the back seat. And she said, whatever's wrong? And he said, God's speaking to me. And she said, what's he saying? He said, Satan is coming after the women. And she said, well, what do you mean he's coming after the women? Well, he said, you think about it. He said, the men are already out in the world. He said, they take a lot of the buffeting of the world pressures and views and the rat race and everything the world holds dear for masculinity. He said, but Satan's coming after the mothers, because he said if he knows that he can that he can say you're missing out on the world, being just a mum or just this or just that, it's not enough. He said then he can get the women to become dissatisfied, and then he gets access to the children. He said the women are the keepers of the next generation in terms of the way they raise their kids. If Satan can bring in a different set of destructive values into the lives of those kids, he'll do it by taking the mums away from their kids. And I've seen that. I've seen it.
That's in broken homes.
Broken homes, absolutely. And women don't realise how important they are in this world. I would say the most important thing I've ever done, and I would throw everything else away, is be a mum. And nothing is of any value to me, not the medals, not the qualifications, nothing. Because my grandchildren, my daughter, my grandchildren, she's getting married this summer, bless her, they're my legacy. They're the things that are important. People are important. Money, power, prestige, the things that people will tell you are important, particularly men. They say it's important that you as boys are powerful, you have the fast cars. I don't devalue a man wanting to have the best in life for himself, whatever. I don't devalue a woman doing that. This isn't a gender specific thing. But we have to realise where God's values, the first institution he ever put together was a man, a woman and children. The family is the unit God built. And if we lose that, we lose everything. So that's where the warfare's been aimed. It's being aimed at families, and now it's being aimed at our youth, because I'm the generation where I'm not techie. My daughter's fantastically techie. I can't control what she's watched on the internet as she's grown up. I've tried to put in boundaries. But I tell you what, our young people are suffering so badly today. They really are. And we've got to find resourceful ways. Social media is one thing. It's got to be used for good. And I tell you what, if you're awake to this principle of light and darkness, you could go on social media now and say darkness, and 99.9% of it is darkness. And we are in a spiritual battle, and it's men and it's women and it's children. We're all involved. We're all called to be put on the armour. You know, be aware, be savvy, wear our spiritual armour. And every day we've got to see that we are part of a bigger matrix and play our role in bringing standards and behaviours and boundaries in that reflect God, not the dark side. And you know, that's what this is about, and that's the fourth dimension as I see it.
There's a lot of disconnect from the fourth dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I don't think the church has ever dealt with it very well, the institutional church, because I think by and large they have specialists have dealt with it. You know, in the Catholic Church you'll have your exorcists, or it's for them to deal with it. But I think that people have disengaged. I think the church has largely doesn't know how to address active spiritual warfare in the right way of dealing with it. And I would say that people have resorted to their own methods of dealing with it, or actively gone after the dark side because they haven't found the answers where they're meant to be found. So a lot of
been led to the dark side.
Yeah.
Unintentionally.
I think sometimes there's great intent. I think sometimes you stumble into it. I think sometimes it's just for lack of guidance. I consider myself really fortunate because in failing my 11 plus so badly, I was put in a convent school because they were the only school that would take me. Not even the comprehensive wanted me. I think I answered 2 questions on the 11 plus, and I got bored and looked out the window. I was very much in my own world as a kid because I was wanting to draw all the time and be an artist, and I didn't like study. But having said all that, in the convent school, I saw women who led like cloistered lives with discipline, their own sense of community, honourable women who really loved the girls that were in their care. And I didn't come from a family where there were great boundaries, shall we say, and they taught me boundaries, they taught me lifestyle. And in that environment, I began to realise that there was a God. I saw God displayed in everyday behaviour, in the focus they had, in the discipline. And I was quite a spiritually centered child anyway. But I remember one day as a small kid, I liked to break laws because I had a fascination for adventure. I remember the first break I ever had, I was 11 in this convent school, and everywhere were these really dreadful statues with bleeding hearts and tears and wounds and everything. And I wasn't used to that, but it was mesmerizing. And there was a church on the grounds, and it had a cloister running alongside it, and at the end of the cloister was a screen. Well, you weren't allowed in there as a child anyway. I was 11. You weren't allowed to go into the church or down the corridor or whatever, but I remember being fascinated because I wanted to see what was at the end behind the screen. So when nobody was looking, I went in my break, and I went down to the end of the corridor, and I moved the screen, and there was a lot of debris behind there, but what caught my attention was a crucifix, and it was almost a life-size one, 2/3 life-size, and it had this plaster Jesus, just a white plaster Jesus on a cross, and he was slightly tipped over, and I thought, you are abandoned, you're lying on your side, you're so lonely here. And my kid's heart wanted to keep him company because he shouldn't have been left there 2/3 locked over on his side. He wasn't being respected, and I didn't know anything about Jesus, and I couldn't have explained the cross view for love nor money. I'd never been to Sunday school, and but I just knew that there was a loneliness and a pain on that cross that needed company, and I still think there's a loneliness and pain in the heart of Jesus that wants company because he hasn't been satisfied. His love for the world and his love for people, his heart is being broken every day by what's going down in our schools, on our streets. You know, when my husband worked at Central Middlesex Hospital in London, you would get a lot of gang warfare around there, and a lot of the people would come in with stabbing wounds. I've been in casualty as a doctor where somebody's died literally from a stabbing in a fish and chip shop, and the person that stabbed them was lying in the next cubicle. And those lives cut short, that trauma, that fear that pervades youth. Jesus his heart is being broken every day because what he's done is done, but he needs people to keep him company now and take that love and that message and the impact of that message into a real world. We've got to take it from the fourth dimension into the third dimension. And you can only function on this planet if you've got a body. He says, you're my hands, you're my feet. Once we're gone from here and we're spirit and we return to God, because it says when we die, our spirits return to God. Once we're out of here, we're useless for that purpose. But while we're here and we've got flesh and blood, our earth suits, as I call them, like an astronaut needs a suit out in space. While we're here in our earth suits, we can do something practical. And it is as practical as raising a generation not to stab their friends, to love people, to respect people. Doesn't matter the colour of their skin, doesn't matter whether they're male or female. Accord them respect. Let them live to the potential and the gifting God's given them. Don't say they can't be surgeons. Don't say they can't be this. See the value of every human being. Love on them. Bring God's kingdom values into our culture. And that's what the church should be doing. It's not, it is about meeting in a building and being a group together. But once you're out of here, it's only for an hour or two on a Sunday. You're meant to be salt and light in the community. And if we're not changing lives, I used to go down to a men's hostel not far from here, and we go and have coffee and biscuits with the guys. And I saw the most broken lives find peace in this way because they got a relationship either back with Jesus, like the guy in the Life Wing at Strange Ways, or they realised that they needed something more than they got. And in that time, I know that there were 5 people who died because they had a lot of issues with their health and whatever. But I knew they died in peace because they had connected the Wi-Fi and they'd found the reason they were here. And it really doesn't matter if it's the last minute or a few seconds of your life. Like the thief on the cross had about 2 or 3 hours to go. And he said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said, today you'll be with me in paradise. And Jesus doesn't want a long, lengthy religious prayer. He doesn't care if you've messed up your life. He just wants you to know he loves you. And it doesn't matter if you're in the final 10 seconds of your life. You can call out to him. And he said he will never turn away anyone that's broken or bruised. However broken or bruised or damaged you are, he said you call out to him, he won't turn you away. If we don't take that message out and we create hoops for people to jump through, laws for them to try and obey, etc., 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 we've missed what we're here for. We're here to serve and to love. And if we don't demonstrate that kind of lifestyle, I think we haven't really connected with the Wi-Fi, because Jesus came to serve, suffer, die, and that's what you see in the Chernobyl people. They all served, suffered, and died for the greater good and laid their lives down. So he's still, I think as a child, I felt that loneliness and that pain, because I think God is in pain. He's not above it all. He's not distant from it. It says we live and move and have our being in him. We are part of a spiritual dimension. We just haven't connected the Wi-Fi to it, and it's an incredible journey. And I'm a fraction of the way there. I just want, in my remaining years, I just want to live in a greater fullness of it. And I'm hoping the art really is the part of that, because that's what I found myself to be above everything.
You feel your art and your spirituality are linked?
I do, because I know when I'm painting that the skill I've got in painting and executing the anatomy and whatever the painting I'm doing now, I'm getting better and better and better. And it's like when I look at the canvas, it's like this inner eye is putting the brush on the canvas. It's like, for me, it's a gift from God. I do believe I was called to be an artist, like some people are called to be great scientists or mathematicians or explorers. And I just think that, being spiritual isn't about, singing hymns and, reading your Bible all the time or praying all the time. That's a part of it. But actually, worship for me is about doing the art, because I know that makes God happy. It's like that runner Eric Liddell said in Chariots of Fire, when I run, I feel God's pleasure, because he was created to be a sprinter. And God gets pleasure if you're being that mum he called you to be, or, that football or whatever it is. He doesn't get pleasure when parents talk their kids down or say you'll never amount to anything, or you little this, that and the other. And I hear so much of that. Kids being cursed basically from God. You little this, that and the other. You'll never be anything. Because I've seen in my generation, a lot of boys particularly were told by their dads, you'll never amount to anything. And you know what? Authority figures' words have great power. Really do. Yeah. So dads have an incredible role to play in families, because boys in particular will look at their dads and how their dads value them as people. And what was it on recently? There was an amazing Netflix about a stabbing where a young 13-year-old, I can't remember the title, and didn't that lad say, and that wasn't just invented script, you know, when I'm playing football, and my dad won't make eye contact with me. Kids know whether you value them, whether you want to get. They don't just want your money; they want your time, they want your focus. I've seen lots of kids grow up in very wealthy families. I lived in quite a wealthy part of London for a time, and I've seen children, and their dads just aren't there for them, and they're like lost. And so I'm not. Dads and mums have a role, and families are meant to have that two-parent thing because kids need it. And there's huge value in both men and women. And this isn't about gender, but don't think you're losing out if you're a mum. You're doing probably the most valuable job on the whole planet, much more than a banker, lawyer, or doctor's doing. They all are important, but it's in the small details that we bring this fourth dimension, the right kind of boundaries and behaviours into the world.
I think we're blindsided by all of the things that don't go with us when we leave.
Absolutely. And that's you just that word blindsided. It's like, it says in the Bible, Satan has blinded the eyes of unbelievers so they can't see it. Well, it's like Satan switched off your Wi-Fi. There is a real devil, very real devil. Jesus spoke about him.
What's your thoughts on that?
About what?
On the devil, Satan, the dark side.
I wasn't there, but what I can understand from the Bible, and it's pretty hazy, but there's a couple of chapters in Isaiah and Ezekiel where it just deals with the origins of the dark side, if you like, and God didn't create a devil. I see God as creator, the ultimate spiritual power in the universe that spoke creation into being, and that was the Trinity involved in that. You can read that in Genesis, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But there's also a whole hierarchy of spirit beings, the highest being archangels. Satan was an archangel called Lucifer. He was one of the highest spiritual beings in the presence of God. He had an outstanding beauty, the Bible said, and he was a gifted musician. And then he got into pride and thought he got competitive. And he basically said to a third of the angels, you can have it better with me. Just put me as your leader. And it basically, the story of humankind is, I think there was just an intense jealousy when we're the only part of the created order that's in the image of God, spirit beings that can think like God, be creative, because we're made in the image of God. I'm not saying we are God in that, but it's like we've got God's spiritual imprint in us. And I think when this dark angel, if you like, saw it, there was just a jealousy. And I think if you see something that you're jealous of, you want to destroy it. And I think there's a destruction. There's been a destruction motivation ever since the human race was first on the planet. I don't believe for a second we've evolved from monkeys, or we've come up. We are high grade. There's no way in science that you see, cells and DNA becoming more complicated. If anything, it's about a decline. So I don't believe in evolution for a second. Obviously, there's mutation and genetic mutation, and we've got great skills to clone and do things we couldn't do before. But I believe that we're just talking about the material realm here. Spiritually, we've been made in the image of God. The angels weren't. He said, that they have not got the same resemblance to God. We've got a very special place in God's created order. And I was watching a program last night. I'd seen it before. It was on YouTube, but there was a swapping at birth, accidental swap at birth. The mum gave birth to a little boy, and she got the wrong baby back the next day. She took the wrong baby home, and she knew within 3 months this wasn't her little boy. Just physically didn't resemble her or the dad. So she got a DNA test. This is in the States, and it turned out there's a 0.0% chance that this is your child. So she then alerted the hospital and said, "Where's my actual son?" So they located the real baby and they did a swap. But my sense is that it's like we've been taken off the maternity ward and raised as someone else's children. And it said Satan's the God of this world. And I think when you're born into a world culture and you're raised by people in disconnect, and a culture and schools and society and politics in disconnect with that Wi-Fi, not valuing it, not wanting to know those values, bring it into the world. We are raised as lost and stolen children, and God's heart has only ever been like that mum, to come and get us back and show us our real identity. And you imagine, like, perish the thought, but one of the royal children being abducted at a young age where they didn't kind of know they were royal. The royal family would do everything in its power to trace that child, and whether they were 12, 13, 14, if that was a royal child, it doesn't matter what their identity was or what they've been through in the world, they would still have royal DNA, and they would then have to be educated in who they are. And so many of us have been raised by, the wrong parenting, and when we connect our Wi-Fi, we have to learn our new identity. We have to learn who we are. We have to learn what our real inheritance always was, which was in the image of God, his DNA spiritually, and then we just have to adjust our thinking to catch up with that fact and behave as the children that God wants us to behave as, which are his kids, representing his values, So again, it gets back to the value of every human being, and I don't care how you would label those guys in this hostel, not so far from here, most people will know it, I won't name it. When they were dying, they'd done some really bad things, some of them, but when they were dying, they knew their value in God, and they were able to die in peace, and they were able to die, and that was simply because in those last few months, they learnt who they were, and they didn't have the identity the world had put on them, but they knew who they were truly spiritually and what their destiny should have been. And it's not too late for them, just because you don't necessarily fulfill everything in this world, it's not too late. That's fourth dimension. I'm excited to find out what that's about. I can't tell you about that.
So let's talk about your piece in the forest.
Oh yeah,
that's a beautiful piece.
Shall I bring it round? Do you mind? Yeah, great. So this is a Ukrainian soldier, and he's in the in the front lines of Ukraine in the woods, and it's dawn. And to me, this is like what inspired this picture was a song from Les Miserables, where it said, basically, you're on the battlefront at dawn, your comrades have fallen, you hope there'd be a tomorrow, and there wasn't. And it reminded me so much of Mary Magdalene in the garden at dawn, coming to the tomb of Jesus to basically anoint his dead body. She had no hope at all at that point that she'd find him alive. She thought she saw him die, how he died, saw how his body had been pulverized. So as a woman, it was her role in society to anoint the dead. And he'd had a very hasty burial, so she spent Sabbath weekend preparing all the spices, and the first day of the week came back. And I believe in Ukraine, whatever's gone down geopolitically, I believe spiritually, and then we will see it manifest in the natural, because everything happens in the spirit realm first. We're going to have a resurrection moment for Ukraine, and everything they've been through, and the fear, the loneliness, the isolation, the death, the sheer bravery when you're outnumbered. Zelensky's leadership, there's going to come a resurrection time. And I thought that the Les Miserables song, Empty Chairs at Empty Tables, is like a blighted Ukrainian landscape now, Kiev and the villages and whatever. And these are comrades who wanted to see a world reborn. And that is a Bible cliche, actually, and in the sense that rebirth, Jesus talks about rebirth. You can't see the kingdom of God unless you're born from above. Well, being reborn is a different vision for the future. And I believe there is a different vision for Ukraine's future than the one that Putin wants to impose on it. And I see a spiritual force in Zelensky and a power in his leadership that I've never seen in any other European leader. Not that I've studied them out too much, but there's something about Zelensky. And I wanted to paint this picture because it's a picture of hope. I believe there's vision. I believe the Ukrainians will see a world reborn, just as every Christian on this planet wants to see a kingdom of God reborn in the hearts of people, because that's where it begins. It's not external things, it starts in your heart. Ukrainians have to have hope. So I listened to the Miserable song, and this painting came out of it. And I'm going to do a parallel one where this is Mary Magdalene. And this little dugout here, you can see the dugout where they go, and there's the trench here. That's going to be the tomb of Jesus, but the stone's going to be rolled away. So out of Chernobyl came a whole study on the Ukrainian war, and I'm working on that now, because for a while I had a house in Latvia. I fostered a little Latvian boy with my husband and daughter, and we got a little house out in Marupe near Riga where we were going to raise him so he could be enculturated with his people. And happily he went back to his birth mum because she was in a position to take him back. But I developed a real love for the Baltics and the people, and it's, you know, you saw the warheads on the airstrip going up when all this sort of stuff started, and the tensions in Eastern Europe. And I know what the Baltics have lived with. I see the legacy in my generation, late boomer. You know, I see the legacy that communism gave, and communism is part of the dark forces. We're not talking about the politics of communism. We're talking about the spiritual principle behind it, which is atheistic. And my main reason for coming to faith, or whatever, the litmus moment for me, my eureka, was when I was on my 32nd birthday. Actually, I got involved with a charity that drove aid out to Romania because Ceausescu's regime had just fallen. I just had my amazing God experience where the kind of the light and presence and weight of God's presence was in the room. We went off to Loch Carron in Scotland, and there was a charity there called Bloxwich. This is in '92, and it ran convoys to Romania. It had been smuggling Bibles in, but now it was taking food, medical supplies. And I said, what can I do? And they said, well, we've got a convoy going out in 3 weeks, so we'll meet you at Ramsgate. So I got on the train, went down, said goodbye to my husband, no mobile phones. And they said, oh, you know, got to Ramsgate, there were 8 nurses, and one nurse's husband, and then a mechanic. So we were 9 women, two guys, 4 lorries. Oh, have you got your driving license? No. Well, you're driving. So I did a 4-hour rotation without a driving license across Europe to Romania for 3 days. We slept in the back of the lorries. And then as a result of all that, I got to hear a guy went to the hospitals, did an appraisal of what was needed in the hospitals, which was everything. There's no anesthetics, no bandages, no rubber gloves. Wrote a report, went to Wembley Arena where there was a massive orthopaedic conference. My late husband was an orthopaedic surgeon. And I said, what can you do in terms of supplying aid? You know, we need boxes of this, that and the other. And then before I knew it, our front garden in West Acton and our cloister in our local Anglican church was just full of medical supplies. So the lorry came and picked it up, took it out there. But the point of this is that there was a guy called Richard Wurmbrand who was a Jewish man, and he came to understand through a little Christian carpenter in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania that Jesus had been a Jew, that he'd come as a Jew, lived under the law, died, and that he was actually the Messiah the Jews were expecting. Anyway, he came to faith, and then when communism was at its zenith, he was put in prison with a lot of other people and tortured, and he was in solitary for 14 years, suffered horrific torture. The Norwegian Christians bought him out for £10,000, and he went to the White House, and he stood before Congress and showed them all the holes in his body. He had 18 massive wounds in his body where he'd been tortured for his Christianity. And he said, people have suffered far worse than me, particularly the women in prison. He said, but he spoke of the Russians because the Russians had brought in communism to Romania. And he said, God loves the Russians just because they're the ones that are the torturers. You know, he said, I used to try and talk to the people that were torturing me to say what beautiful hands you have. And when you're not beating me or pulling fingernails out, you must go home and caress your wife or love your children. What makes a man do this? And he said sometimes the guards would break down. And he said in that time, he said whenever he got out of solitary confinement and he was let home, he said his first thing was to go back into the underground church, and he would try and reach the Russians. And he would go into the barracks where the Russian soldiers were, ostensibly under disguise to sell watches because they love watches. He said you'd have Russian women officers with big alarm clocks around their neck on chains because they loved watches. And he said, so he'd go in, they'd talk about Jesus, and they'd gather around them, and if somebody came through they weren't sure about, he'd stop talking and just talk about watches. And he said one night, he said he could see two Russian officers, a lady and a man, And he stopped and he started to talk about Jesus to them. And he said, would you like to come up to my flat with my wife and I will cook for you? He'd been tortured by that army. They came up and he started to tell them about Jesus. The Russian officer burst into tears because he received, the Wi-Fi got turned on at that point because he prayed and asked for that to happen. And he started to cry and he said, why is it, he said, that nobody's told us about this Jesus? Why is it we've been kept in the dark? I'm the happiest man. He was dancing around the flat. And I believe that Richard Wurmbrand wrote 3 books, but one was Tortured for Christ. Others, I read them all and then gave them to a Romanian, young Romanian student at a Bible college. But I realised then that the front line of darkness and light has been fought behind the Iron Curtain for so long, and now the Iron Curtain's fallen. What is happening? Those same spiritual forces. Ignore the figureheads behind them. Ignore the name Putin. Ignore the name Stalin. Ignore the name Lenin. What is the spiritual force behind these? What's the puppet master behind these people that wants to re-establish the former Soviet Union? That wants to impose? I don't care if people hide behind Russian Orthodoxy. If you are sending young men as cannon fodder into battle, if you're not observing the laws of the Geneva Convention, if you're bringing down the flights of people like Prigozhin that have stood against you, what is the dark force behind the geopolitical events that we're seeing? So I never look at the news by looking at names of presidents or things. I never think of the personalities. I think of the personality behind them, and the forces of dark and the forces of light. And it was Richard Wurmbrand that helped me contextualize everything that's been happening in these terms. And he's the reason I came to have this kind of understanding that I do, that I reconnected the Wi-Fi, because his was such a challenging life. And I thought, I'm not sure I'm capable of that bravery. I don't know what I'd do if I was forced facing torture, or I was asked to disown Christ, because a lot of the Christian women in the churches, they lost their jobs, they were out of work. Many of them had to survive by prostitution. Is that something I could do? So these are real people, real lives, real forces, and we're in a war, and that's why a lot of my attention's focused on Eastern Europe and that front line between communist forces and others, really.
I feel like that panic is spreading, not just Ukraine, all over the world.
I do, and I know, there's a term for it, which is lawlessness. But wherever you look in society, boundaries that back in the day when I was raised are no longer being observed. There's just extreme selfishness and egotism, and it's survival of the strongest. In a culture where, women and children were put first, in a sense. You look at the Titanic, the weakest, even in like Gaza today, the women and the children cannot get food because the men are climbing the walls and fighting their way to get what's available. As a little child that's starving, but one of those men could go and get food and bring it to that child, I doubt that's happening. It's always the most vulnerable and the weakest. And I think that's why I love the life of Jesus so much, particularly Luke's Gospel, because in Luke's Gospel, Jesus has a heart for the marginalised and vulnerable. He particularly pursues and validates women, prostitutes, whatever, because he says, he said on one occasion, a woman who was a prostitute, the story, you probably know it, he goes to the house of a very well-known religious figure, and it's full of these very elite religious men sitting at these tables or reclining at table. And this prostitute comes in and she starts to cry over Jesus' feet. She doesn't stand and go over, but she lies down and she kisses his feet and she wipes her tears away with her hair. And they're all tut-tut. It's another sort of Christine Keeler thing. What's Christine Keeler? It's the same sort of elitist, sort of patriarchal thing. Oh, tut-tut, And he says, well, look, when I came in, you didn't wash my feet. You didn't give me a kiss of acknowledgement. She's come in. She hasn't stopped washing my feet with her tears. And he validates the heart. Jesus always validates the heart. He doesn't mind what vessel it's in. He doesn't care about the history of the vessel. He validates the heart. And I'm looking at so many hearts now that have just become cold. loveless, icy. They'll, even youngsters stabbing people. There's just no kind of common decency and love and respect anymore. And it's I do see social media and the internet as being responsible for getting right into people's hearts. Yeah. That's what I see.
So if you could go back to an 8-year-old you, what would you say to yourself?
I would say don't mind the fact that you're bottom of the class and you've got more in you. I knew there was a God at 8, and I would just say God's got a plan for your life. Just hold on there, and you are important. Because I was always told I wasn't important because I was a girl, or I wasn't important, and I wore glasses, and I was a skinny little kid, and I was bottom of the class. And I never really thought of very much of myself, but I think I'd sow value and love into that child and say, it doesn't matter that you're not the best looking kid or that you wear glasses, be happy, carry on drawing. You've got a special gift there. God's going to use it, and you're very loved.
Is there a piece of advice that you've received through your life that you'd like to pass on to the next generation?
Yeah. It was something I heard from Richard Wurmbrand, and he said there was a man walking along the riverbank with a bag of pebbles, and he kept throwing the pebbles into the water because he enjoyed the splashing sound. And when he got to the end of the journey, he had one pebble left, and he looked at it and realised they weren't pebbles all along, they were diamonds. And he said every minute of your life, every hour of your life is a diamond. He said use it wisely. And another thing, he said that there's not one person you've loved on or whose life you've influenced that won't thank you when they get to heaven, because they're there because you were there and you bothered with them.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Stefan.
It's been great. It's been a great chapter. I can tell that you're highly read, highly educated. So I think that 8-year-old will be proud.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Bless you. Thank you. I hope it wasn't too preachy, because I thought, okay, great.